Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Belgium or Spa sprint race post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this sprint race? Was it like all the other sprint races in general? Does it excite you? Does it, lack the energy that I would think the sprint race would have? Me personally, I do. I think most of the sprint races are not the greatest show. They're kind of like follow the leader around the track because the issues of potentially, knocking someone out or knocking yourself out are too high to do damage to the car. And with the, qualifying and the real race, GP race coming up right after, it makes it really hard to figure out how to play these sprint races. And so there's not super risks that are involved in these. Leading to what we kind of saw today, I thought was it just pretty much a go around, following each other. There was a few little passes here and there, but you really had to be sure of yourself. And on this track, it makes it really difficult to do that without getting those advantages that you really needed, or the mistakes from other drivers to really pass on this circuit. But what was your thoughts? And just like a normal race, I go from the back of the pack, work my way to the front of the pack, going through each driver, telling you, what happened to that driver, if I know what happened, and my thoughts on how they drove in this race, or sprint race in this case, in this situation. So without further ado, we'll start off with Pierre Gasly, who started off in 8th and ended up in 20th with a DNF. He did lose 12 spots at the very first lap. Mainly, this is all due to the fact that they found an oil leak on his car, and so they were working on it frantically, before the sprint race and couldn't really get it out. And they were hoping to really start off in the pit lane and make a decent sprint race out of it, but ended up making it this just another practice session for them, testing out, cars and making sure they know what's going on for tomorrow. So he was kind of like in there, didn't really get truly, do any kind of racing per se. It was just kind of following around, testing, checking the tires, making sure everything else was working. All of that was kind of due to that oil leak that caused him, which is a shame because he was up there in 8th, so he could have potentially gotten some points for Alpine, which they really need to keep in the running. Then we come to Franco Colapinto, the other Alpine driver, who started off in 20th and ended up in 19th because his teammate did not finish. He was starting from the pit lane due to changes on his rear wing in Parc Ferme, so he had to start from the pit lane. He did gain one spot at the first lap because of his teammate dropping out, and then he's the only person that started off on soft tires. Running this sprint race, it really didn't seem to help him at all, as he ended up in that back of the pack anyway. Then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who started off in 17th and ended up in 18th. He did gain a spot, of course, because of Pierre Gasly dropping back, but he still lost a spot as well. So he's not that good around this track for some reason. I think they need to figure out what's going on his car and see if they can make adjustments after he's ended up on the podium, before our nice little break. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with Hülkenberg. Hopefully they can figure out what that is and if it's fixable for tomorrow's race. Then we come to Kimi Antonelli, who spun out in qualifying and kind of messed up his qualifying session. So he started off in 19th and ended up in 17th. He did gain that one spot because of Pierre Gasly, and he passed Hülkenberg for 17th on lap 5. So him just trying to come back in, trying to get his grounds and figure out where he is. He's hoping to make up some more spots than he did, but didn't quite make it in that running. So he's kind of lagging in the back as well. Then we come to Alexander Albon, who started off in 16th and ended up in 16th. He gained a spot, but then lost a spot to Hamilton. So he ended up in the same spot he started off with. He seemed to be struggling a little bit in that Williams car around this track. Hopefully they can tweak that and get that to his liking for tomorrow's race in that regard. It's a decent run, I think. Get some data on that Williams to help them out for tomorrow's race and possibly for qualifying as well. He kind of came close to the Aston Martins, but was not really able to pass them during the sprint race, and then got pulled up and passed by Hamilton. So there's some issues there that need to be worked out. This gives us to Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 18th and ended up in 15th. He gained a spot, of course, with Gasly going out. He did pass Hulkenberg for 16th on lap 4, and he also passed Albon for 15th on that very last 15th lap. So he kind of came up hoping to go farther up in the field, but was only able to make up a couple of places. I know he has had that back end to lock up significantly in his qualifying, and so that kind of messed up his qualifying sessions. So hopefully they can get the grips, and it sounded like they did figure out what the grips were for that, but hopefully that is really the case. And so tomorrow's race and qualifying will go fairly smoothly for him, and he'll be farther up in the grid with that. I mean, it's hard to gauge some of these drivers on the sprint race. It seems like they're doing a decent job, but who knows how they play out tomorrow in the full race. Then we come to Fernando Alonso, who started off in 14th and ended up in 14th. He did gain a spot on that first lap because of Pierre Gasly, but then, of course, he lost it to his teammate, Stroll, on that first lap, so that kind of leveled things out for him. Didn't really make any other grounds or any other, advancements in this sprint race, so they'll have some work to do for qualifying and the the race tomorrow in that regard, to see if they can get the Aston Martin really working. And it didn't sound like he was really confident in that, because he was saying that it sounded like he was getting the most out of that car, and that's the reason why they were up there so far to begin with. Of course, his teammate was right behind him, qualified in 15th and ended up in 13th. He did pass 2 spots the very first lap, one of those being his teammate, and of course the other one being Gasly, so that kind of evened that out and got him ahead and let him get into that 13th spot for the end of the sprint race. And there wasn't really much action in that sprint race, as far as I could tell, for the Aston Martins. So they have a little ways to go on that to try to figure out how they tweak that to get a little bit more pressure, because, as I said, Albon was kind of putting pressure on them during the sprint race. I wasn't able to pass him, of course, then got passed by Hamilton, but with the Aston Martins right there, not really gaining ground on the people in front of them like Russell, it's going to be hard for them to do anything in qualifying or the full race tomorrow. So hopefully they can figure out what that tweak is. George Russell started off in 13th and ended up in 12th, mainly due to Pierre Gasly's going out, so gaining that one spot. Again, the Mercedes seems to be lacking something in this circuit, or this, so hopefully they can figure that out. And of course, with the chance for rain tomorrow, Russell might have the edge on that to gain some ground there. So hopefully things will work out for the Mercedes, and they'll be able to at least put some pressure on the people around them. Then we come to Yuki Tsunoda, who started off in 12th and ended up in 11th, gaining that spot because of Pierre Gasly, and otherwise he was just kind of sitting there, and he was kind of in that blah mood after the race as well, because he didn't seem like anything was drastic was being able to be done on that Red Bull. Hopefully he can get some of those updates and tweaks that make it him a little bit easier to drive that second Red Bull in the future and let him participate. So that basically gets us through the bottom 10. And of course, I said it was a fairly dull race, so it didn't get really any kind of passing going on in that regard. So make this a quick rundown. So this gets us to Liam Lawson, who started off in 11th and ended up in 10th. Gaining that spot because of Gasly going out. Didn't really see a whole lot of him. I know there were some balancing issues, it sounded like, on his radio. So hopefully they can get that resolved and figure it out for qualifying and the race tomorrow as well. Then we have Gabriel Borletto, who did a really good job getting back up there and started off in 10th and ended up in 9th due to Gasly going out. But still getting up there just outside the points, unfortunately for him. So that's a bad thing, but a good thing, because he's up there putting a little bit more pressure on Isaac Hydjar in that running. So I think hopefully they can make those final tweaks and let him shine in that rookie position that he's in, fighting the other rookies around him. Then we come to Isaac Hydjar, who started off in 9th and ended up in 8th. Gaining that one spot because of Pierre Gasly going out and basically staying behind Oliver Behrman for the race. Didn't really put any kind of pressure on them as far as I could see during that race. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the qualifying session and the GP race tomorrow. But otherwise, a decent run for Isaac, just staying up there, making sure he didn't make any mistakes, and coming home with at least a point for the Racing Bulls. Then we come to Oliver Behrman, the back of the Haas team, who started off in 7th and ended up in 7th. He didn't get any advantage for Pierre Gasly going out, but he was still stood there in his position, not getting any kind of issues going on. So good, getting some extra points for Haas, staying ground, making some of that confidence for tomorrow and qualifying, hopefully, with those Haas drivers. Then we come to Carlos Sainz, who again was looking for just some consistencies and some stability for him. Starting off in 6th and ended up in 6th, getting back up in the points, getting some points for Williams is always good to see. Trying to get his confidence back together after having some issues with his car the last several races, when he's starting to look fairly good, getting some ground behind him, starting to understand how that Williams car behaves. So hopefully that plays out for the qualifying session and the race tomorrow as well, so that he can really shine and show what the caliber of driver that he is, and of course comparing it to Alexander Albon, who's really outshining him so far in this season, so that kind of plays a role in that as well. Then we come to the other Haas driver, Esteban Ocon, who started off in 5th and ended up in 5th, so a really good qualifying session for him, and he's able to maintain that throughout this sprint race without too much trouble. Pretty far behind, I think, the rest of the field, but in general, still a good run for the Haas, gained some valuable points, even though it didn't change a whole lot currently in that standing, but it gets them closer, so hopefully during the GP race tomorrow, they can actually get some points and help them out in this constructor standings. But a decent run for Esteban Ocon, and a great run in the sense for qualifying to get up there to start off with anyway. Then we come to Charles Leclerc, who started off in 4th and ended up in 4th. He gained a spot on the very first lap by passing Lando for 3rd on that first turn 5 corner. After that long straightaway, was able to kind of get in line and be able to get the edge on Lando and pass him. But he ended up 10.17 seconds behind Lando by the end of the sprint race, so that Ferrari has a long ways to go. I think he did a really good job in that Ferrari, looking at both of those drivers, but they need a lot of work on that Ferrari to make them really competitive to the Red Bull and the McLaren ahead of them, to put any kind of pressure on them at all. So we'll have to see how that plays out for qualifying and potentially the race tomorrow as well. But overall, he did a really good job taking advantage and getting that one position, but then having to lose that position a little bit later in the race because of the difference in performance in those vehicles. This gets us to our top 3, where we have Lando Norris starting off in 3rd and ending up in 3rd. He did lose a spot in the very first lap with Leclerc passing him for, in that first thing, but he came back and passed Leclerc for 3rd on lap 4. So he's able to come back fairly quickly and take that 3rd position on that 4th lap, and then putting pressure on Oscar and potentially Max as well during the sprint race. So he's up there running fairly good, and he had the fastest lap overall in the sprint race, even though it doesn't really count for anything. It's just kind of neat to note that, in the sense of he potentially has that pressure for his teammate and for Max if in the GP race potentially. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the qualifying sessions and the race tomorrow. But a really good run, I think, and generally for Lando. Even though he lost a spot, he was able to regain that and put a pretty big gap. And, as I said, put pressure on his teammate for those front 3 positions to potentially get 2nd or even 1st in this sprint race. So we'll expect good things from him tomorrow. Then we come to Oscar Piastri, who started off in 1st and ended up in 2nd. He had a really good run. He did lose that spot at the very first lap, but he had a good start, kept Max behind him on those first corner. But of course, after that long straightaway and that braking position, with Max having, the draft going on, even though there was no DRS, was able to, get out in front of him make that run and pass him on turn 5. So that was the pretty much gist of it. And then he was kind of trying to figure out how to get past Max. Was never able to really gain the extra ground, as that Red Bull had the better straightaway, power and speed, whereas the McLarens had better, cornering speed in that run. So going into those long straightaways, Max could gain the ground that he needed to keep Oscar behind him. So overall, I think Oscar did a decent job. He may have been able to play a little bit more defense to keep Max behind in that very first lap, but it's hard to really tell with that extra power speed that Red Bull has over the McLarens in the straightaways. So that low downforce issues. So I think Oscar did a good job, and of course it's just to minimize the points, as it's just a sprint race. So we'll have to see how it plays out in qualifying and the GP race tomorrow to see if Oscar can pull out and make that win for him. And of course, this leads us to Max Verstappen himself, who started off in second, ended up in first, gained that one spot in the very first lap, passing Oscar at turn 5. So a really good run for him, being able to play it out, play it safe. Knew he's having a little bit of trouble getting to that first corner, but able to plan out ahead, get that draft going, and with that extra speed of that Red Bull was able to pass him and then keep Oscar behind him. I know that it sounded like Max even made a mistake at one point during the race, but was still able to do everything right. Sounded like from the exit interviews that he was basically doing qualifying laps for every lap for the sprint race. So that was kind of interesting to hear, having him be able to give it at all every lap, every session, and have that gap maintained between him and both McLarens for the most part behind him in that running. So any real mistakes would have cost him that first position. So a really good job for Max. And just to give you a rundown for that, we can see that, lap 3, we had a 0.54 second lead for Max over Oscar. By lap 5, it was basically the same at 0.58 second lead for Max over Oscar. And then just about halfway at lap 10, it was 0.48 second lead for Max over Oscar. By lap 13, it was up to a 0.75 second lead for Max over Oscar, and it ended at that exact same gap with 0.75 second lead for Max over Oscar. So it was a really tight run for the whole sprint race. Not a mistake was really given in the sense that it would have allowed them to take advantage of that. So it was a really good run for Max, decent run for Oscar, and a decent run for Lando as well. Even though he didn't get out there quite as well he liked in qualifying, he was able to still maintain that third position and minimize the damage between him and his teammate for the overall Drivers' Championship. So what did this do to the drivers' standings? Well, not a whole lot. As you can see here, no changes were made during the driver's standings for the sprint race. We'll have to wait for the GP race to see if anything changes for that. But a couple of notes here are that Isaac Hydjar kind of gained a little bit of ground on Lance Stroll, keeping ahead of him. And of course, we have Carlos Sainz getting up to 16 points, so he's now tied with Fernando Alonso. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the GP race to see if any changes are there as well. So that's the main gist of what happened in the Drivers' Championships. There's a little bit of points here and there that kind of closed gaps or opened up gaps. But for the most part, it was pretty much steady as we go. And for the constructor standings, nothing's really changed either. The big notes here are that Haas jumped up a little bit, so they're closing their gap on Aston Martin. So they're kind of right on the edge of passing them again for that 8th position. And of course, Red Racing Bulls kind of got that extra point to put them 1 point ahead of the Aston Martins. So we'll have to see how the Aston Martins do in general for both of those teams. And then, of course, we have the same lineup, and the gaps kind of shrank a little bit between Red Bull and Mercedes. And then, of course, you have a giant gap now between Ferrari and McLaren for the for the constructors' standings. So what is coming up next? Of course, we have the GP race for tomorrow. So we have a length still of 4.352 miles. but we're going to have 44 laps being run instead of the 15 that we had for the sprint race, for a total race distance of 191.415 miles. And of course, the lap record holder, I believe is still Sergio Perez from 2024 with 1 minute 44.701 seconds. And of course, this circuit was first introduced in 1950. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.